The snow had been falling since before first light, and by the time Elias Vance saw the smoke, it was so thin and so gray that he nearly mistook it for a trick of the storm. It rose from a hollow off the north road, a single trembling thread bending against the wind, and something in the sight of it made the old cowboy rein his horse to a stop. He was 41 years old, and he had learned a long time ago that a fire that small, in weather this cruel, almost always meant somebody was trying very hard not to die. He could have ridden on. The town of Juniper Flats was warm and waiting 8 miles behind him. But Elias turned his horse toward the smoke instead, because that was the kind of man the prairie had made of him, and within minutes he would meet the people who would change the whole shape of his life. What he found in that hollow, he would remember until the end of his days. A broken-down wagon sat half-swallowed by a drift, its canvas top torn and flapping like a wounded bird. Beneath it, kneeling in the snow with a thin blanket held open over a still figure, was a young woman. She could not have been more than 22. Her lips had gone blue at the edges. Her hands were raw and cracked, and yet she did not run when she saw the stranger ride up. Instead, she rose to her feet and stood squarely between Elias and the figure on the ground, her chin lifted, her eyes fierce as a cornered hawk. "You'll not touch my mother," she said, though her voice shook so badly the words nearly broke apart. And Elias, looking at her, understood at once that she had been standing guard like this for hours, maybe longer, and that she would have gone on standing until the cold took her too. "Easy now," he said softly, raising one gloved hand. "I'm not here to take anything. I saw your fire. I came to help." He swung down from the saddle slow and careful, the way a man approaches a frightened animal, and only then did he see the rest of them. Tucked into the lee of the wagon, huddled together beneath every scrap of cloth the family owned, were children. He counted them twice, because the first count seemed impossible. 7 of them. 7 small faces, ranging from a boy of perhaps 12, down to a baby girl bundled so tightly that only her round cheeks showed. All of them pressed close for warmth, all of them watching him with the wide and silent eyes of the very hungry. The eldest girl, the one who guarded them all, was named Hannah, and the woman lying in the snow, her breath coming shallow and slow, was her mother. Her name was Margaret Calloway, and she was 47 years old, though the fever and the long road had made her look older. Hannah told him this in pieces as Elias worked, because he did not waste time asking permission. He stripped the blankets from his own bedroll and wrapped the sick woman in them. He built the failing fire back into something that could throw real heat, and while his hands moved, Hannah's story came out of her in a low and exhausted voice, the words of someone who has held too much alone for too long and has finally found a place to set it down. Their farm 3 counties east had failed. Their father had taken a fever in the autumn and had passed quietly in his sleep one cold morning, with Margaret holding his hand, and they had buried him beneath the oak he had loved. After that, there had been nothing to stay for, and nowhere that wanted them. So Margaret had packed her 8 children into the wagon and pointed it west, toward a brother in Oregon she had not seen in 20 years. But the mountains had come too soon, and the snow had come sooner, and 3 days ago, Margaret had begun to cough. By yesterday, she could no longer sit up to drive. They had stopped here because they could go no further, and Hannah had taken the reins of the whole desperate family onto her own young shoulders. She had rationed the last of the flour. She had kept the little ones from wandering. She had stood between her sleeping mother and the wind for the better part of a day and a night. Elias listened to all of it without a word, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the 7 children and the sick woman and the girl who had refused to fall. Then he made the choice that the people of Juniper Flats would talk about for the rest of his life. "Here is what we're going to do," he said. "I have a ranch, a day's ride from here. It's warm and it's dry, and there's more room in it than one old man has any use for. You're all coming with me, every one of you." Hannah stared at him, as though she had not understood the words. "There are 9 of us," she said slowly, as if to be certain he had counted, as if to give him a way out. "I know," said Elias. "I counted twice myself." And something in the plain certainty of his answer broke the last of the girl's strength, so that she finally sat down hard in the snow and wept, not from grief, but from the unbearable relief of being, for the first time in months, no longer the only one holding the rope. It was no small thing, moving 9 people through a mountain winter, and Elias would not pretend otherwise. He could not carry them all on one horse, and the wagon was finished. So he did what the country taught a man to do, which was to solve the problem in front of him and trust the next one to wait its turn. He lifted Margaret across his saddle and walked beside her, leading the horse on foot through the drifts. He set the smallest children atop the bundles he could salvage. The older ones walked, and when they tired, he carried them on his back two at a time. And Hannah walked beside her mother's slack hand the whole way, talking to her, in a low, steady voice, though her mother could not answer. It took them the rest of that day and most of the night, and there were hours when the cold seemed certain to win. But Elias kept them moving, and he kept them together, and a little after midnight the dark bulk of his ranch house rose at last out of the snow like a promise kept. What happened over the following weeks was the slow, quiet work of bringing a family back from the edge. Elias gave the children the run of the house and let them eat until their hollow cheeks began to fill. He moved Margaret into the warmest room near the great stone hearth, and he sat up the first 3 nights running, feeding the fire and spooning broth between her cracked lips, while Hannah finally slept. The fever was a stubborn thing, and it did not break easily. There were nights it climbed so high that the old cowboy bowed his gray head and asked, in the rough and unpracticed way of a man who does not pray often, that this good woman be spared. And on the 4th morning, with the dawn coming pale and clean through the frosted window, Margaret Calloway opened her eyes, looked at the unfamiliar ceiling, and asked in a thread of a voice where her children were. They were everywhere, was the answer. They were thriving. By then, the 7 younger Calloways had filled the silent ranch house with a noise Elias had not heard within its walls in more years than he cared to count. The 12-year-old boy, whose name was Samuel, had appointed himself Elias's shadow and followed him to the barn each morning to learn the animals. The middle girls had discovered the kitchen and the hens, and the baby had a way of falling asleep against the old man's chest that undid something in him he had thought long since hardened over. He had lived alone on that ranch for 11 years, ever since the wife of his youth had died, and in all that time he had told himself he preferred the quiet. He understood now, watching these children chase one another across his floors, that he had simply forgotten there was any other way to live. There was one evening in particular that Elias would carry with him always, a small, ordinary evening that asked nothing of him and gave him everything. The fever had not yet broken, and Margaret still slept her uneasy sleep by the hearth, and the cowboy had come in from the barn bone-tired and snow-dusted, expecting the same silence that had met him for 11 winters. Instead, he found the whole brood gathered on the rug before the fire, and Samuel had found the old fiddle that had hung untouched on the wall since the cowboy's wife had died, and was sawing out a clumsy, hopeful, half-remembered tune. The little ones were dancing, if you could call it dancing, stamping and spinning and laughing in the firelight, and Hannah stood in the doorway of her mother's room, watching them with the first true smile he had seen on her face. She caught his eye across the warm and crowded room, and she did not look away, and something passed between the weary old man and the girl who had refused to fall that neither of them had words for. He hung his hat on its peg, and he sat down heavily in his chair, and he let the noise wash over him like the first warm day after a hard winter, and he understood that whatever this was, he would do anything in his power to keep it. He did not yet know how soon that power would be tested. But there was a harder road still ahead, and it ran straight through the town of Juniper Flats. For a family of 9 needs more than one man's stores can hold through a long winter. And so Elias hitched his good wagon and drove into town for supplies, with Hannah beside him on the seat. He had thought, in his plain way, that the people he had known for 20 years would meet the news of his new household with kindness. He was wrong, and the wrongness of it stung him more than the cold ever had. For word had already gone ahead, the way it does in small places, and the looks that met them on the main street were not warm. A wandering widow with 8 children and no husband and no land was, to certain hard hearts, not a tragedy to be eased, but a burden to be kept at arm's length. And more than one shopkeeper found reasons their shelves were emptier than they were. Hannah felt the cold of those looks, and her face went tight and still, and Elias saw in it the same fierce pride that had made her stand guard in the snow. But the girl did not lash out, and neither did he. Instead, outside the mercantile, with half the town pretending not to listen, Elias Vance said a few quiet words that traveled farther than any shout could have. "I have known most of you the better part of my life," he said, I have pulled your calves and dug your wells and sat up with your sick. I am asking now, plain, for nothing but fair trade for a family that has done no wrong but lose everything. The ones of you who can find it in you to be neighbors, I'll not forget it. And the ones who can't, he paused, and looked down the street without anger. Well, I expect you'll have to live with the man in the mirror, same as the rest of us. Then he tipped his hat, and he went about his business. It would be a fine thing to say the whole town changed its heart that very afternoon. But people are slower than stories, and grace takes the time it takes. What did happen was smaller and truer. An old widow named Esther Hartwell, who had buried 2 husbands and knew something about being looked at sideways, came out of the church hall and pressed a basket of bread into Hannah's hands and said she would be by Tuesday with more. The blacksmith, shamed perhaps by Elias's words, sent his boy round that evening with a side of bacon and no bill. One kindness made room for the next, the way a single ember will catch a whole hearth if you shelter it long enough. And by the time the worst of the winter had passed, the Calloways were no longer strangers in Juniper Flats, but neighbors, known by name, expected at the Sunday table. Margaret grew strong again. It took the better part of 2 months, but the day came when she walked the length of the porch on her own and stood looking out at the white fields with her children gathered around her. And Elias, watching from the barn door, felt his throat tighten at the simple sight of a woman standing in the sun, who had nearly not stood again at all. She came to him later that evening, when the children were abed, and she tried to speak of repayment, of debts, of the impossible weight of what he had done. And the old cowboy stopped her gently. "Ma'am," he said, "I have eaten alone at that long table for 11 years. You and yours have filled a house that I had given up for empty. If there's a debt between us, I am not the one who holds it." Spring came late and sudden to that high country, the snow giving way all at once to mud and green, and the wild noise of returning birds, and with it came the question that no one had wanted to ask through the long dark months. The Calloways had been bound for Oregon, for a brother who was waiting, and the passes would soon be open. Margaret sat the whole family down and laid the choice before them honestly, because she had never been a woman to hide a hard thing from her children. They could go on west to the kin who had sent for them, or they could stay. Hannah, who had carried them all through the snow, looked around the warm and crowded room that had become the only true home her younger brothers and sisters could clearly remember, and then she looked at the quiet old man who had counted 9 people in a hollow and not flinched, and she said what they were all thinking. They stayed. Elias deeded a corner of his land to Margaret in her own name, so that no one could ever again look at her family as folk with no place of their own, and the older children worked beside him through the planting and learned the rhythm of the ranch as though they had been born to it. Samuel grew into a tall and steady young man with a gift for horses. The middle girls married, in time, into good families in the valley. The baby who had once slept against the cowboy's chest grew up calling him grandfather and never once thought to call him anything else. And Hannah, who had stood in the snow with her chin raised and her heart breaking, became in the fullness of years the keeper of the whole place, the one the others turned to, the steady center of a family that had nearly frozen to death in a hollow off the North Road, and instead had found a home. As for Elias Vance, he lived a long while yet, long enough to see the children of his children running across the same floors, and when at last he grew old and tired and slept more than he woke, it was Margaret and Hannah and all the Calloways who sat with him, who fed the fire through the night, who held his hand at the end the way Margaret had once held her husband's, so that he passed quietly and warm and surrounded, an old man who had been alone for 11 years and had not been alone for a single day since. He had ridden out one bitter morning meaning only to fetch supplies, and he had come home with 9 strangers, and he had told anyone who asked in his later years that it was the finest bargain he ever struck. The people of Juniper Flats told the story for generations after, and they did not tell it as a tale of charity, for that was never quite the truth of it. They told it as the story of a man who saw a small gray thread of smoke against a great white storm, and who understood, the way only the truly kind ever do, that there is no such thing as too many people to save. The snow that had nearly killed a family melted every spring into the creek that watered their fields, and the children who had once huddled hungry beneath a broken wagon grew old and full and surrounded by love, and not one of them ever forgot that the whole of it, every harvest and every wedding, and every warm and crowded Christmas, had begun the moment a stranger looked at 9 desperate souls in the cold and quietly said the words that saved them all. Every one of you. You're all coming with me.